Thank you very much, and thank you to Ben for organising this conference, and to the Political Studies Association for funding it. I have to say the last bit because I'm on the executive committee of the Political Studies Association, and everyone else on the Political Studies Association knows about how members never recognise the wondrous work that the executive committee actually does. I also need to thank my co-authors for this paper, who are Colin Hay and Matt Barr. Matt is here. Colin, unfortunately, is in Paris. It's tough that somebody had to be there. This is part of a much broader project that we've been doing with colleagues in the Hansard Society. Particularly, we'd like to acknowledge the work of both Matt Corris and Ruth Fox in that project and in collecting the data which this draws on. What's the title I've given to the talk is again slightly different to the title of the paper, but I think they hopefully do connect to one another. And I want to talk about what and how people think about politics. I can say a little bit more in terms of the what question than we've already heard, and I want to reflect quite a lot on how it is that they think about politics. And the starting point, of course, for the how is, well, they don't think about it very much, unless, as in our case, we forcefully think about it by sticking them in a focus group for 2 hours. But there's a kind of broader point behind it, which is that there's a lot of interesting work that's been done in social psychology and behavioural economics, which is about the way that people think and reason. And I wanted to apply some of that thinking because I've used it in other work that I've done with Peter John and other colleagues around the implications and potential practices of MASH, to think through what that work would tell us about the way it is that people think about politics. So the structure of the talk is to capture some of that analytical thinking around the concept of fast and slow thinking about politics. Then to talk about the mode of investigation that we used, which was focus groups. Then connect fast thinking with negativity, slow thinking with a slightly more rounded understanding of what politics can and can't do. Then talk about the implications of that in terms of how you think about reforming politics. So the essential conceptual framework is drawn from Daniel Kahneman's book, Fast and Slow Thinking, which is a brilliant book that captures virtually 50 years of academic research and work undertaken not only by himself but also by many colleagues, which he acknowledges throughout. And it is a superb book in that it captures, I think, a lot of the thinking, the shift in thinking about the way it is that people reason, the way that people approach trying to understand the world around them. And the core distinction is between fast and slow thinking. Fast thinking is more automatic, and slow thinking tends to be more intentional. But throughout all of this work, there's a tremendous emphasis on just how complicated thinking actually is, and how people use a combination of information, evidence, computation, using beliefs, heuristics, to effective influences to more sustained forms of reason. And what I want to do is use some of that to help us explore the way that we think about thinking about politics, assuming that they think about politics in pretty much the same way as they think about other stuff. And although I don't think it's true, actually, of all of the presentations we've had so far, I think there is a tendency in political science to use either an implicit or an explicit rational choice to frame the way in which people do actually think, as if they are constantly aligning their objectives and values against a kind of means-end judgment and using information to come to a wise decision. What I want to argue is that almost all people's thinking about politics is both a bit more muddled and a bit more variable. At this point, of course, you might think, well, speak for yourself, Stoker. So, the essence of the difference between fast and slow thinking is captured in that framework. There's an appropriate discussion in the paper about the difficulties of presenting things in tables as if things could be drawn quite so starkly different as that. But the essence of the difference is, I think, captured by the words there. So fast thinking is the kind of thinking which is probably predominant in the way people approach the world and try and understand the world, which they come to fairly quick judgments and make a fairly rapid decision about the way in which they're going to understand the situation. The whole point about slow thinking is that it takes more time, it does require a lot more effort, and is generally more painful. And Kahneman has a lot of fun throughout the book about teasing how people have in their heads, as the hero of their lives, them as a system 2 thinker, but actually almost all of their main decisions are made with their maths system 1 thinkers. So that's the distinction between fast and slow thinking. If we capture it by basically saying that slow thinking is definitely more intentional, definitely more reasoned, definitely more reflective. Fast thinking tends to be based on a quick judgment or assessment of the way that the world is. Now, why would I be interested in that? And that's, I think, because you could argue that a lot of people say, well, in the way that politics is done, given that people don't pay that much attention to it, really fast thinking dominates in politics, and perhaps that's good enough. As Paul was saying, people use heuristics to make judgments about political situations in complex settings, and it's the dominant mode of citizen-leader exchange. I mean, what often people are about if they're a political leader in a speech is to try and get the sound bite or the particular message that's going to hit home. So a lot of the way in which our political discourse is conducted is through a kind of fast thinking mode. And what I want to ask in this paper is, with what consequences? And the reason why I regarded that as a reasonable question to ask is that the Kahneman book is just fantastic in pointing out that System 1 is brilliant, and basically no one could live their lives without System 1, but it is prone to a number of systematic errors of judgment. In Sarah's paper, she mentioned 2 of the most well-known of the errors of judgment that people make, based around anchoring and immediately accessible issues. In the book, I lost count of the number of error judgments that Kahneman mentioned, but it involves a range of things like System 1, when being used, leads people to confirm existing explanations, neglects ambiguity, tries to answer easier questions rather than the harder one posed, uses existing or available information, overrepresents low risk or highly public events, tends to be more reactive to change than to continuity. And in a quote from the book, which is, that captures the reason why we might say, if we're thinking about the way people think about politics, if it's all fast thinking, maybe we should be concerned. Kahneman says, System 1 automatically and effortlessly identifies causal connections between events, sometimes even when the connection is spurious. Now, you think maybe that's a description of your colleagues, but actually it is indeed a description of the way in which most people think about politics. And if we're concerned about the way that people think about politics, trying to learn from this literature about the distinction between fast and slow thinking, I think, might be helpful in enabling us to do that. Now, the tool that we used were focus groups. Now, initially, when we chose focus groups, we chose them primarily because we thought it would give us an opportunity to get people to talk in more depth about politics than we had managed to get them to talk about politics when we'd asked them survey questions before. Because obviously, in a way, because you've got somebody captured in a room for 2 hours, they inevitably have to think slightly more about the issue, and because also they're in conversation with other people, and what was, and still is, I think, one of the most valuable parts of the focus group is the fact that people actually discuss things with one another, and somebody puts forward a bit of argument or evidence, and somebody counters that, and then other people join in. So you actually get the benefit of having immediate judgments challenged and people beginning to debate with one another. And that, I think, happened in all of our focus groups and clearly was of value. But actually, what we accidentally did was also trigger a bit of a fast after a slower thinking, because in order to just break the ice in terms of getting people around to talk about politics, we asked them two opening questions. The first opening question was, what was your first political experience? And the second question was, what words would you immediately associate with politics? Those two questions, I think, were questions that stimulated relatively fast-thinking responses. The rest of the discussion, I'm arguing, stimulated a slightly slower set of thinking responses. What were the findings? Well, in fast-thinking mode, I think there's no doubt at all that politics is viewed as a very dark art indeed. In response to the question of what's your first political experience, almost everyone identified something that was being done by others, not by them, and largely being done to them. In terms of the word association, negativity dominated throughout. 2009 word associations were presented in the 14 focus groups that we actually held. 132 were negative and only 7 could possibly be categorised as positive, and we were being very generous as to what counted as positive. And this is a breakdown, and I think what it helps to do is put a little bit of depth into the arguments I think that really Paul, Sarah and John have all agreed on, which is if we had to answer the question of this overall conference, which is culture declined, the answer is there's not evidence suggesting that maybe it has. I think the survey evidence is much more powerful in telling us this. What the focus group evidence tells us is in more depth what it is that people don't like about the way that politics is. And if you looked down that list, basically it's kind of leads you to respond. If that's the way you understand politics, then wow, it's not surprising you don't like it very much. And clearly bore out, and he was very pleased by it, the reason why somebody might is bold enough to write a book entitled Why We Hate Politics. So I think if you want the answer to the question of why we hate politics, those tell you a few things which are not too positive. In the discussions in the focus groups, honestly, obviously, those of you who do focus groups know that they're mostly incredibly amusing things, and you always have to have a few drinks afterwards. But constantly, the experience that we had was that it took us at least half an hour before we could stop people ranting about how crap they thought politics and politicians were, and how basically stupid we were we wanting to spend such a long period of time talking about politics to them. And that was actually true of all the focus groups, despite the demographics and despite the fact that we moved around the country in order to conduct the focus groups. But over time, perhaps because we wore people down, we got people also discussing and debating and reflecting, etc. We got people into what I want to describe as a slow thinking mode. And there I want to look at some of the things that came out when they went into this more slow thinking mode. They weren't uncritical. They were still making very critical comments about the way the politics works. And in the paper what I do is present a representative quote, but then give an idea of the number of quotes that are very similar throughout the focus groups that captured the same kinds of critique. So people were bothered about politicians not listening. They were bothered about the way accountability works, and we had almost exactly the same arguments that Sarah was referring to in terms of the way she put it. People anchor their discussion about accountability entirely based on their own experiences of accountability. And the difference between the performance accountability that they experience at work and the accountability that they don't experience in the political system was, as far as they're concerned, a massive and problematic gap, which explained their scale of antagonism. And then I think that the idea that politics was run by another a group that was kind of beyond them and beyond their comprehension also came out very strongly. But as the focus groups developed and as we picked up more of the slow thinking, you can begin to see a glimmer of light. Some slightly more positive things were said about politics. It starts becoming less entirely black. I wouldn't like to say it becomes white, but it becomes a slightly off-grey kind of colour. And there are a mixture of quotes, and I give you the broad range between 9 and 17, that talk about how it's impossible to please everyone, recognising that that's a dilemma in politics, that the media creates a difficult context, maybe it's up to citizens to make more of an effort to get engaged, that not all politicians are self-serving. That was often accompanied by a story of a politician actually doing something that they thought was worthwhile, that they recognised that it was a characteristic, perhaps, of British culture that people went for excessive moaning. They couldn't imagine life without politics, and there was, in several instances, an outburst of grudging respect for politics in the middle of the focus group. So there is, I think, an arguable contrast between the way that people respond to the idea of politics and the practice of politics when they're in fast thinking mode, compared to the way that they respond when they're in slow thinking mode. That's what we think that the analysis of the focus group has established. So what does that then tell us about the way in which we think about politics today? Well, almost all of politics today is constructed very much in fast thinking mode. So I decided to put it all in M's, but marketisation, BDisation and managing are three characteristics of the way in which politics is and has been changed. So it's changed as a product in terms of the way that it's been offered. So people do experience politics, and politics is constructed with much more targeted, much more specific messages, using the skills of marketing but putting them into selling political ideas and political parties. It's clearly become far more mediaised as well, in the sense that it is done through the media and perceived through the media. And then it's not only about getting elected, that is subject to the same kind of marketing practices, actually governing is subject to the same marketing practices, and governments spend an inordinate amount of resource and effort compared to 40 or 50 years ago, the way that they present themselves, present their arguments and present their policies. And as we know, there's some work that shows that that's actually going to affect the way in which people actually make decisions in government itself as well. Now, one argument, and there are people that put this argument forward, which is, well, okay, but all this fast thinking simply oils the wheels. People live in complex worlds with complex lives. Politicians need to get their messages across quickly. Citizens need to consume their political understandings quickly so that they can come to a judgment. What's the problem? It's just a way in which people now do politics because that's the way the world is. But what I think our evidence points to is that there can be, or potentially you could argue, are long-term corrosive effects by doing politics entirely in fast-thinking mode. And that if we allow politics to continue in fast-thinking mode, it will constitute a kind of reinforcing capacity for negativity in the way that people think about politics. And that, I think, is also borne out in the reform ideas that we got from people at the end of the focus group. So the focus group conclusion, we asked people to sit down and write out 3 suggestions of reforms of politics that they would like to adopt. And I think what they tell us is that people in their reform thinking mode are often objecting to the fast thinking nature of politics and wanting to find ways, not necessarily of always making decisions themselves, but actually having a chance to share and reflect on decisions in a slightly more extended way. So if you look at that table there, in a way I think what's really interesting about this conference is that it actually has been really valuable as far as I'm concerned, because it's reinforced the fact that actually good political science research can actually tell us what it is that perhaps could be the heart of the reform process. Because if you look at the things that Nick and Sarah were arguing should be potential reforms in their paper, or and then add some of the arguments that John was making about people's interest in direct democracy as well. If you look at the three top listings there, what it is that people actually say that they're bothered about, they are quite close to those kinds of concerns about the way that politics is conducted, the way you need to make it more accountable, the need for better education, better information exchange, and then the opportunity potentially for more citizens to have a say. So my conclusion is straightforward, which is that it's twofold. One is, I think that inanity matters, and we've been offered a particularly inane version of politics for the last 30 years, and I think we've begun to see the effects of that on the way that people think about politics is they think it's inane, and that's because the way that they've been offered politics is inane. I think the second thing is that that does mean that I don't think that these findings tell us that people want to become extensively involved as deliberative democrats their entire life, but what they want is a better relationship with representative politics and more opportunities to intervene in the political process when it's going on. I think we have, out of our research, some clear signals for reform. Whether or not we can persuade the political elite that that's the direction they should go in, I, like John, am not entirely sure we'll succeed in that, but I do think it's interesting that the research and the evidence points in that direction. Thanks, Nancy.